Hola. Bueno, here we are in week 6, and you are getting ready to put together your initial bibliography for your presentation 1. And so I wanted to visit with you a little bit today. I know we did a little bit on searching for sources last week, but I wanted to point out a couple of other things to you, and then I will talk to you a little bit about your work for this week, and then that will be it. So let's say we've got our Google Scholar, we're doing our Google Scholar search, and remember that we went over some things last time I spoke with you. Like in Google Scholar, you can control, my stuff's set in Spanish, but you can control what your search range is. I recommend searching for things that are 5 years or younger, if possible. Going back to 10 years is acceptable, particularly for things that are culturally based and not medical science based primarily. But further back than that, it needs to be something really important, like a seminal study that you would want to cite, or maybe there was a lot of work done in the early 2000s or the late 90s on a particular cultural topic, and then not a lot of progress since. But ideally, most of you, for most of your topics, should be finding sources from about 2015 forward, going back to about 2008 forward if you have to go pretty far back. So the search that I did here is on diabetes, and let's say that I found this article, and I've sort of done some tinkering to get just down to this article, but let's say I found this article. Remember, I can click on the little quotes. I can pull the citation in either APA or MLA format. APA and MLA format in Google Scholar are not perfect. But they're oftentimes better than people's attempts to approximate it freehand, and they're at least something that will allow you to get back to an article if you lose track of it. So what you want to do probably is copy paste the citation into a Word document so that you at the very least have the titles and the authors of the sources that you think you're interested in, right? Okay, so then let's say we click on this article and we say, oh, I think this is really interesting. And we get into it and we see the abstract and we look at the abstract, and note that the abstract is basically like a mini article, right? So it tells you what the study was about. Oftentimes it will tell you something about the design, the methods, the results, and then it will give you some conclusions. Oftentimes the conclusion section is a little more developed than that. But anyway, let's say that we looked at this article and thought, oh, I have to have that, right? Well, if you hit get access here or full article here, you're going to get told that you need to pay for it. Remember that if you have your library tab open, it will give you access to more things than if you don't have your library access. So even if you're searching in Google Scholar with Obler Library tab open, you will get access to more full text articles than you would if you just searched Google Scholar without the library tab open. You can also go into databases, and there are all kinds, but you can go down to Google Scholar and actually search Google Scholar through the library website. That's another choice. Remember, you can limit your search a little more by using the Health Sciences Library, but the one search works pretty well for most of our purposes in conjunction with Google Scholar for this class. Anyway, so I go over here, I put in my article title that I can't get a hold of, but I really want, into the database, or not the database, we want the OneSearch. Into the OneSearch, just paste it in there, right? And then it finds the article for me, sure enough. All right, so I click on the article to see if by chance it will open here. And what I see is that there really doesn't seem to be a way for me to get it directly online. So then if I really want this article, I can request it through Interlibrary Loan. And what that looks like is you put in your Bengal ID, you put in your last name, and it will pull up all the information of the article already filled in, and you basically say, submit request, say I want this article, right? Now, for a book, it can take up to a couple of weeks for something to come in, but oftentimes if you request articles, it will take a day or two, sometimes 3 days for it to come in. And then what would happen is you'll get an email, and when you get an email, you'll get a link that will direct you to your electronically received articles. And if I had any right now, they would be listed in here. And then I would be able to click on them and get the full PDF text of any article that I had asked for through Interlibrary Loan. Now, the nice thing about articles is that unlike books, you also don't have to return them. The library will automatically take your access away after 30 days. While you have access to them, I recommend downloading them to your desktop and saving them, probably with the author name and the title and maybe the year of the piece in the whatever you name the file, so that if you ever wanted to go back to that article for something, you could do so. So, say you're compiling your works cited and you find 2 articles that you really want, but they just aren't available to you in full text yet. This is a way to get them, and you can say, based on the abstract and the whatever other access you have to that article, the title, I guess, and maybe some references sometimes. I really think this is a source that I want, so you can include it in that preliminary bibliography that you give me. When you get the article, it may turn out that it's exactly what you want, or it may turn out to be a little less what you want. But this is one way to get materials. Now, if you ask for materials through Interlibrary Loan that the library actually has, either in physical copy or in electronic copy, you will generally get a reject message telling you, hey, we don't want to Interlibrary Loan this because Interlibrary loaning articles cost money. We have this, and you should look again. You can get it here. And so be judicious in your use of interlibrary loan because, again, there is a cost associated with it for the university. But if you want something and we don't have access to it through our university library sources, this is a way of getting some materials. Okay, and so let's go look at what you're doing this week. So this week I've left you a little bit of time to do some of your work on your presentations. But you're also doing some other activities, and I'll talk to you briefly about those. Okay. And so for this week, you are writing your family history Spanish-English dialogue. Remember that that dialogue that you write will be what you will use for your interpretation activity at the end of this chapter, right? And so you're writing it to be performed with another student who will be the patient for the interpreter to interpret, okay? You have the activity of translating a family history form. And maybe I should actually reverse the order of these. So let me show you the family history form. So here's what you have. You have the form you're going to translate in English. And you will note that you probably want to download it and save it to your desktop to use for reference. But you will note that the form is really pretty brief, mostly a list, right? This is a pretty simple translation in a lot of respects, but you gotta translate the content. So you're gonna find problems, right? Like we might have historia or historial familiar. Fine. But for adoptado, do you just put adoptado question mark, right? Do you put adoptado/a question mark? Do you put es adoptado/a question mark? Do you put the arroba, the at symbol, to replace the OA like I do in your emails? Do you put an X to be gender neutral, right? This is a decision that you're going to take right off the bat, and then the idea would be to be consistent, right? And so one of the gender discussions that's going on in the Spanish language right now is most nouns are gendered, and the assumption is always masculine unless there's a known feminine recipient, right? So that's why we have things like los estudiantes, right? All of the estudiantes are masculine unless they're all female, and then we would have las estudiantes, right? Or if this were going to be generic, the question would be, adoptado, es usted adoptado, right? And the assumption would be that because both men and women, or people who identify as masculine and feminine, are going to answer the question, that the default is male. But the language is starting, there are elements of the Spanish-speaking world that are beginning to question that gender preference for the masculine as the neutral, right? And so some of the options include using the at sign in place of where the O would be, right? So you would have adoptado a, both implicit in there. Sometimes the slash, like O/A, but the O/A, if you have to do it across a sentence, for instance, can get a little confusing. Sometimes we're replacing that O or that A with an X and simply choosing not to define a gender for terms. All of those things are controversial. All of them are linguistically complicated and ethically complicated. And so what you're doing really is making a choice and applying it consistently, right? But the other question with adoptado is that sufficient for somebody who's receiving this form in Spanish to understand what's going on? Or should you include the verb, like es adoptado or a, or whatever you resolve to do? And if you include the verb, do you have room for it in the form? Because the other thing you're going to find about forms is that they're going to come in a template, and that the space that you're going to have to maneuver is going to be limited. So does adding the verb cause a problem, right? Those are just a couple issues in these first 3 words that you're interpreting. So then, if adopted and you do not know your family history, skip the family history section. Well, here we have a couple problems. One is that we discussed in the live classes, what do we do about the word know? Some of you know that in Spanish, there are 2 possible terms. We could use saber or we could use conocer. Saber, I tell students, tends to mean to know something quantifiable, like yo sé que mañana es miércoles, or yo sé que 2 y 2 son 4, right? Factual knowledge that can be measured, evaluated for fact, right? Quantified. Conocer tends to mean to be familiar with, right? So you don't say yo sé Marta, you say yo conozco a Marta, right? Because it's impossible to factually know a person in a measurable way. And so you're familiar with them, right? So here we could say, si es adoptado a arroba X, whatever we decided to do there, y no sabe su historia familiar, right? And then we can move on from there. Or we could say, si es adoptado a or whatever, y no conoce su historia familiar, right? Or we could say, si es adoptado a whatever, y desconoce. Desconocer is to be unfamiliar with. Desconocer, D-E-S, conocer, right? To be unfamiliar with your family history. Any one of those options would work. I told the students that I prefer conocer here rather than saber, because for me, the implication of saber versus no saber is to have factual information that you maybe presumptively should have, to be ignorant of something. Whereas to just be unfamiliar with something is a little bit more forgiving in my mind as a word, right? But you may choose differently. These are the kinds of things that we deal with in translation. Whereas interpretation is we want accuracy, but it's an accuracy within a range, right, that orality permits. So orality doesn't permit the same level of finesse, really specific detail that translation does. When we translate, we really are going for nuance of message. We really are going for grammar details, but we're also going for vocabulary details. We're going for what is conveyed. We're going for specificity and exactitude in a way that when we interpret is less possible. And so decisions like, do we use saber or conocer here, or do we say desconocer instead of no conocer? Those are things that you should think about when you translate. And there isn't necessarily a right answer. There are wrong answers. If you think of translation as an art, right? There are lots of ways to do good art, right? And so anybody who's ever studied art history knows that there are a variety of ways in which art can be elevated to something fine. But there's a lot of bad art. And people who know a lot about art can sort of define for you what constitutes lack of skill or bad art. So when we're translating, there are many ways to do a good job. There are many ways to accomplish the task artfully, but there are also a lot of ways to do it badly, right? And so what we're aiming for is good translation, understanding that good translation is going to have variety and variation, but that bad translation is bad. It's grammatically inaccurate, or it conveys the message wrong, or it's again, the wrong vocabulary, right? And so when you think about translation, every word matters. You can see why I'm not giving you terribly long translations. So if adopted and you do not know your family history, skip the family history section. All right, easy enough, except for the fact of how are we going to say skip? And here again, there are vocabulary options. We could say salte, right? Or we could say omita, right? Omit. Or we could say deje, right? Or we could choose to change the structure of the sentence and say, siga adelante sin completar la historia familiar, or el historial familiar, for instance, right? So we have options. Several of them might be correct. There are a couple of factors. One would be what gets across the point the best and the most effectively. One would be how much space do we have, and if we change the structure of the sentence, are we creating space issues in this document that we're sort of stuck working within the parameters of it, right? One would be what is the reader, the Spanish-speaking reader, going to best understand, right? And so all of these should factor into your decision. Then we have to be careful for false cognates, right? So we look at indicate which relative has the following diseases. Relative is not relativo. Remember that a relative, as in a person that is related to another person, is pariente, right? And then we have sometimes translation can actually improve a document. Indicate which relative has the following diseases. Is that really what we want the patient to do, or do we want the patient to indicate if any relative has the following diseases, right? And so you could say, indique si algún pariente tiene las siguientes enfermedades, instead of indique cuál pariente tiene las siguientes enfermedades. Again, decisions to be made. You could adhere more closely to the text you were given, or you could decide that intent is more important, and maybe you can add clarity here by wording things a little bit differently than they were worded in English, right? You have to decide what word you're going to use for deceased, right? We can use muerto, we can use defunto, we can use fallecido, right? But what we want to do is choose one and then be consistent with it. And you may have reasons. Maybe to you, muerto sounds very harsh. Maybe your family uses fallecido, or maybe you prefer difunto, like Dia de los Difuntos, right? But you also want to take into consideration, again, what is going to be most accessible to the patients who would be looking at this form. Okay, so again, you're going to work through this. You're going to work through it in slightly different ways. And you should use, when you are translating, resources, right? So translating should never be done just in the absence of resources. And you can always use a good Spanish-English dictionary to help you, but there are some other tools that are also good to have around. One that I really like a lot is Lingua. So instead of Spanish Dict or Word Reference, I like Word Reference better than Spanish Dict, or just Googling something, which will usually give you a very literal translation. I like Lingua because it provides you with some context. So say, for instance, that we wanted to look up the word skip. Okay, so it gives us some vocabulary. Saltar, saltarse, brincar, pasar por alto, omitir, saltear, evitar, esquivar, right? And then down here, it gives us a bunch of contexts in which something is used, and then it's translated those contexts to Spanish. So we can look, for instance, in this case, your drive is ready to use and you may skip the next section, right? So here, skip is used in a similar way to you may skip to the next section of the form, right? And here the vocabulary they use is pasar a la sección siguiente. So they avoid the word skip and say go on to the next section, right? So that's a possibility. The second one says, I will skip the small talk and get straight down to business. Again, this notion of jump over something, right? Jump over this part of a sequence, right? You could use pasar por alto. Entonces, pase por alto esta sección y continúe con la siguiente, right? So that's another option that you would have. The next one down, you see saltarse las normas, right? So you could use saltar. I would use saltar la sección, but I suppose you could use the reflexive and say saltarse la sección, right? Saltese esa sección, right? Note that the next one, skip the event, just says don't compete, right? Instead of the doctor told me to skip the event, it says the doctor told me not to compete in the event, because in this particular translation, the person decided that skip was a confusing word and that the essence of skip was just don't participate in the event, right? But if we look a couple down, children can march, skip, or crawl. Los niños pueden marchar, saltar, o gatear. Note that the context has nothing to do with skipping a section on a form like we would want for our particular context. So what I like about Lingua is that it's going to offer you a bunch of vocabulary options and their various definitions, but then it also tends to offer you external sources in which things are used so that you can get a little more into the nitty-gritty of whether you're using the correct term in the correct way, right? But like I said, I tend to use Word Reference, especially on my phone. I have Word Reference as opposed to Spanish Dict. I really don't like Spanish Dict very much. I think it tends to lead to a lot of inaccuracies, and Google Translate tends to be literal and give you something. So if, for instance, I look up skip in Spanish and allow it to go to the Google response, it's going to give me omitir, which is actually kind of interesting because that's not what I would have expected. But let's say, let me think of another one. Wow, it doesn't want to try no. Interesting. I think Google's listening to me. But anyway, usually the first answer that you get at the top of the page is whatever the Google translation is. See, here. It gives me for sí, ver. But we know that in Spanish, and then if we click, we can get other translations. But oftentimes people look at it, get this translation, and go, boom, that's what I'm going to use. And we know that depending on context, it could be a lot of different things. And then Google will try to give you some information about when to use which, but it's pretty sparse in terms of what it provides you versus word reference, versus Lingua, even versus Spanish Dict. So strongly recommend that you use some sources that have some information for you, right? Including a good Spanish English dictionary if you have a good old paper dictionary. That is an excellent source. Okay, so then we have your list of relatives, right? And here we have mother, father, sisters, brothers, mom's mom, dad's mom's dad, dad's mom, dad's dad. Now again, madre, padre, easy enough, right? You would have hermana with the S, hermano with the S, but then you get to mom's mom, mom's dad, dad's mom, dad's dad. Remember that there is no such thing as an apostrophe S in Spanish, so we can't say madre's madre. That's impossible. So we can use the de structure and say madre de su madre, madre de su padre, padre de su madre, padre de su padre. That we could do. There are a couple problems with that. Number one, it might get lengthy for the little box that you have to work with. And number two, to me, this is a confusing way to think about things, right? Like another option would be maternal grandmother, maternal grandfather, paternal grandmother, paternal grandfather. That could have issues in the sense that somebody might not think of someone as a grandparent, but rather as their parent's parent. But I think that in terms of just general sanity of the person having to think through this, it might be preferable, and it will probably fit better in the spaces than madre de su madre, madre de su padre. Also, some of the students in the live class just thought, madre de su madre has its own sort of weird sounding, potentially offensive connotation. Okay. Remember that current in Spanish is another false cognate. Corriente exists, but it would be preferable to use actual, right? So when you say age now, age currently, the preferred terminology would be edad actual, right? And then you could decide o de fallecimiento o de muerte, o cuando murió, right? Depending on sort of how you decide to approach that little box. Again, space is an issue. Okay. And then we went through this little list of diseases and conditions. And so if somebody were taking this form, they would need to check off which, if any, of the relatives listed there have suffered from these diseases and conditions. And so one of the first things we have to think about is, okay, what do we do with disease versus disorder, right? Because a lot of the things that you're going to be looking at in this list are either labeled diseases or disorders. Disease can be called enfermedad, right? I think enfermedad would be the correct vocabulary. Disorder is a false cognate. Oftentimes we want to go to desorden, right? And you'll see it written out, even in medical texts, you'll see desorden used that way. But really, desorden is not the ideal term for this particular situation because it means mess. It means things are disorganized in Spanish more than it means error in the function of a body part, which is really what disorder means in the medical context in English, right? So it's not that it's never used, but it's that it's not the preferred word. So instead of desorden in Spanish, you would probably prefer trastorno, right? Trastorno, Trastorno, as your word for a disorder. Okay. So then we think about Okay, so I brought up your Quizlet common hereditary diseases list because it will give you a visual, right? But so, um, again, down here for disorder, you have trastorno or afección as another option, right? Um, and a lot of the other vocabulary that we're dealing with here. Remember that in Latin, right, things like hyperlipidemia, right? You basically have a Latin prefix, hyper, and then lipidemia, so all Latin, right? So in Spanish, it's going to be pronounced in a very similar way. Remember that in English, we mess with vowels a lot more than we do in Spanish. In Spanish, vowels say their name. So when you're struggling with the pronunciation of something, pay attention to the vowels. I, e, a, right? So hyperlipidemia. Hyperlipidemia. Things are pronounced exactly by the vowels saying their name, right? And so that can help you with your pronunciation. But anyway, the hyperlipidemia, la hyperlipidemia, right? What you need to pay attention to here is what happens to Y's from Latin when they go to Spanish. Notice that they turn to I's in Spanish, right? What happens to words that end in sion, S-I-O-N or C-I-O-N? One thing is that they're always feminine. Sion words are feminine. Another thing is that they take that accent on the O, right? So here we've got hipertensión, right? Okay, so those are a couple of the immediate things. So we go back to our list and we look here, and we've got heart attack. How are you going to say heart attack? Well, you can say infarto cardíaco. You can say ataque del corazón. You could say ataque cardíaco. You could say ataque al corazón. Any of those would get the idea across. Angina, angina, right? For coronary artery disease, you can say enfermedad arterial coronaria, right? Or you can say la arteriopatía coronaria, which would be preferable here, right? You've got all the kinds of cancer, cáncer del seno, cáncer del colon, cáncer de la próstata, right? Notice osteoporosis, another Latin word. So when you go to Spanish, you say osteoporosis, right? Because you pronounce all the vowels the way they're pronounced. Drug abuse, you can say abuso de drogas, you can say uso ilícito de drogas or uso de drogas ilícitas. You can say adicción, drogadicción, right, as another option. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the social history and talk about ways to perhaps soften the term drug abuse. You've got autoimmune disease, right? So when you see disease, you're going to go typically to enfermedad. So you're going to say enfermedad autoinmune, right? And what happens to words with two M's in Spanish? Well, let's see, did we include autoimmune disease on here? Yeah, autoimmune. Autoinmune. Note that words that have two M's in English go to NM in Spanish, right? So immediate, inmediato. Immune, inmune, right? So MM goes to NM in Spanish. I'm trying to think what else I want to emphasize to you. Things where you have acronyms like COPD, right? The acronym tends to be the same words in Spanish, usually in whatever order they would be in Spanish. So if we see COPD, right? We go over here. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. In Spanish, the acronym is EPOC, right? If we know chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, in Spanish we have enfermedad pulmonar obstructiva crónica. Same words, but in the order in which they make sense in Spanish, right? And so the acronym is EPOC. Now remember, when you're dealing with a patient, that many patients aren't going to know acronyms. They're not going to know what COPD is, or they're not going to know what EPOC is. And so it behooves you, as you're learning vocabulary, when there's an acronym, to learn what the words for that acronym are, so that instead of just saying EPOC to a patient, you could say enfermedad pulmonar obstructiva crónica, and at least give them the vocabulary to figure out if that's something that they know they have or have heard of, or could put together in their head, right? So CHF, we have congestive heart failure, right? Okay, so in Spanish for CHF, we actually have, and I need to fix it on your Quizlet sheet, we actually have ICC, right? So we have insuficiencia cardíaca congestiva, right? So congestive heart failure, insuficiencia cardíaca congestiva, or you might hear fallo cardíaco congestivo as well, right? Okay, remember that you've got, for kidney, you've got riñón, but for affecting the kidney, you also have renal, right? So we can have enfermedad del riñón or de los riñones, or we could have enfermedad renal. We could have piedras de los riñones or piedras del riñón, or we could have piedras renales, right? Either one of those things would work. Then the word stroke, right? The vocabulary that you will most often encounter for stroke is derrame cerebral, derrame cerebral. But the problem is that derrame cerebral is actually a brain bleed. And more commonly, what people have is an embolism, is actually a blockage in the arteries in the brain, right? And so that's embolia, or you might hear apoplejía as well, and so since sometimes we don't know what a stroke actually is, in other words, we don't know whether it's a brain bleed that's causing the problem or whether it's embolism that's causing the problem, we have another vocabulary word, which is, let's see, let me get a blank document here, which is accidente cerebrovascular, right? Cerebrovascular accident. So that's a general catch-all term for stroke that allows you to describe what's happening for somebody if you or the doctors don't yet know what the stroke consists of, right? Because in fact, embolia or blockage is a more common cause for a stroke than an actual brain bleed. So derrame cerebral, even though it's one of the most oft seen, is actually sort of miscontextualized sometimes to refer to stroke. For sudden cardiac death, right, we could have muerte cardíaca repentina, right, which is the word de repente in this form for sudden instead of suddenly, right, muerte cardíaca repentina, or you could say fallecimiento cardíaco repentino. Note that the gender agrees with the noun, right? Or we could have muerte cardíaca súbita, right? Which also means sudden in Spanish. So muerte cardíaca súbita or muerte cardíaca repentina for those, okay? And so when you're doing your translation, you can work through all of these things, but I wanted to at least give you a few hints. Now, another hint that I have to give you about the process for doing this task is that when you download the Spanish template, and I will warn you now that Adobe Forms that we have to create the way that I have to create these are not a perfect science, right? So I've tried as hard as I can to make this functional and the forms work for you, but like the check boxes, there are some things that will be wonky about it. Try to work with it. Don't let it frustrate you overly. If something really doesn't work, let me know. But Google Forms, anyway, is the best that I have to replicate a form for you, but not perfect. Okay. So what happened? So I downloaded from the assignment, I downloaded this document, downloaded down here, right? When I clicked on it, it opened it right here in my browser. And so in my browser, I can type, right? No problem. And I can put, great. The problem is that if I type into this document in my browser, it won't save any of the content. So even if I save the document, it will save as blank and all of your work will go away. So you cannot open the document in your browser. If it's in your browser, it's not going to save. But when you download it, it downloads to your computer. So on a PC, it's a little different. You got to go down here into your little toolbar at the bottom and go into downloads. On a Mac, here's my downloads. But anyway, I go here to Spanish template. I can even minimize this, right? So I go here to Spanish template. There it is. Okay. So now when I type into it, when it's in Adobe on my desktop, when I type all my content, now when I save it, it will save with my content in it, and I will save myself hours of frustration because my document wouldn't work before. So make sure that when you go to do this translation exercise that you download to your desktop and open on your desktop. Notice I'm not in my browser at all. On your desktop and save from there in order for your document not to get erased. All right? So that is that translation exercise. I'm actually going to reverse the order of the two exercises. I'm going to put the translation before the dialogue. Some of you may have already written the dialogue, but here's the thing. Thinking logically, if you are a patient, you've completed a family history form either by filling it out in Spanish or by having it site translated to you, or maybe you're capable of filling it out in English. Whatever the information is here, that's what the patient is going to follow up on. So say that I mark that 4 of my relatives have died of colon cancer, right? The doctor is going to have a chat with me about those relatives, about what ages they were when they died, about what screenings I've had for colon cancer, about what ages they were when they got the cancer, maybe about what treatments they received, right? Or if I say, yep, everyone in my family has diabetes type 2, then the doctor is going to have conversations with me about, again, the age of onset, perhaps the lifestyle of those people, perhaps my own lifestyle, perhaps whether I've had my glucose tested, perhaps whether I've ever been diagnosed with diabetes type 2, etc., right? And so when you think about this family history form, you can think about what the dialogue would look like, right? The dialogue would likely be a follow-up on the topics out of this family history form that were of particular interest for a particular person's family history. The part that we won't do on the online class because I try to mandate you as little as possible to have to get together on Zoom, because I know that meeting virtually can be a problem, but that I would like you to do is the site translation. And site translation basically means that you read something like this form in English, but provide it to, say, a patient in the waiting room, maybe in Spanish, right? And so rather than having a translated form because somebody actually wrote out the translation, this would be you facilitating this form to somebody else by explaining it to them, by reading it to them from English to Spanish, and then the information that they provide you from Spanish, you would record in English, right? So if you ask somebody, voy a nombrar los siguientes parientes y usted me dice si están vivos o si han muerto, right? Y los parientes que voy a nombrar son madre, padre, hermanas, hermanos, madre materna, padre materno, padre, madre, madre, abuelo. All right. See, this is why the mom's mom and dad's mom think it's confusing. Abuela materna, abuelo materno, abuela paterna, abuelo paterno, right? That's how it's less confusing to me. Anyway, so then you say, okay, su madre, and the person will say, presumably, viva, or difunta, or muerta, or fallecida, or whatever it is. Padre, no answer. Hermanas, well, here you might have a problem. And as the person facilitating this forum, you might say, ¿Tiene hermanas? Sí. ¿Cuántas? 5. ¿Y todas están vivas? No. ¿Cuántas están difuntas? 2, right? And then you might follow up. So you might say, okay, la que está viva, ¿cuántos años tiene? Bueno, tiene 50 años. Y la que está difunta, ¿cuántos años tiene? Bueno, una tiene, la que está difunta, ¿cuántos años tenía en el momento de fallecer? Bueno, una tenía 13 años y la otra murió el año pasado a los 48 años. Okay, so I would document that, right? Etc. And so as the person who's providing this form, you would be translating the form but speaking it orally. So you're translating what you're seeing and writing, but you're speaking it, right? Sight translation. And then you are recording the information that the person's giving you in Spanish in English, right? And in this particular form, there's not a lot of recording required because basically in the alive and deceased, you would be checking boxes and you would be recording maybe the age of the person at death, right? But in other activities that we're going to do, there'll be more recording. Okay. And so then you go through and you facilitate the rest of the form. In class, we do this as a in-class activity in partners. If you wanted to get together with a partner online and practice giving them the family history form, you could do so. You could also record yourself sort of facilitating the family history form and just pretend that somebody was responding to you, even if they weren't. You can omit the patient response part, right? But anyway, this is a good step for getting the vocabulary into your head and a good step for practicing pronouncing it and a good step for thinking about what might come up in the family history portion of a patient-doctor exchange, right, or a patient-nurse exchange. So I recommend the practice of at least trying to sight translate the history form, even though it's not in this class a mandatory submission activity, okay? All right. So anyway, like I said, when you translate the family history form, I recommend doing that before you go back and write your family history dialogue as a logical follow-up to the family history form. You're doing your bibliography. We talked about that at the beginning of this session for presentation 1. And the other thing that you're doing this week is you're watching Tamara Bassett's lecture. Tamara Bassett is a lecturer in our department. She did a master's in anthropology. And for her master's program, she interviewed a number of child interpreters, people who had been asked to interpret as children for their family members. And that particularly people who are now on the ISU campus. And you may have had this experience, or you may know heritage speakers who have been put in the position of going with grandma or mom or dad, or having some job where, I, for instance, volunteered at a hospital and sometimes was dragged down to whatever room to interpret for a patient in the hospital because they didn't have on-site interpreters. And so interviewed these child interpreters and found out a little bit about their stories, about what their experiences of interpreting were and what kind of legacy that left for them in their various lives and ways, right? And so I think it's really interesting. And then you will do a little bit of a follow-up interpretation forum after that, and that is this week's work, right? Next week, we are moving towards your actual interpretation activity, which will involve using this dialogue that you will have written this week. So your second interpretation activity, the one on family history, okay? And then we will start to get into social history next. So this is your work for this week. Hopefully this video sort of helps you get through some things with a little bit less headache, and I will talk to you soon.